very critical, for example, because like some life support systems needed to be activated in a couple of weeks, and if something happens, if something goes wrong, if something we would be able to handle, and we would be able to activate the system. Some of scenarios was to terminate the business from back home. So probably that's why our institution was especially from very experienced people who already flown in space and being able to troubleshoot this problem. And for us, what was very interesting, and it was interesting not only for us, it was very interesting even for engineers, because usually if we do some different parts of the station, for example,
Excelentíssimo Senhor Presidente dos Estados Unidos, peço asilo político para eu, meus filhos, família Júnior, que é uma quadrilha de crime organizado, falsificando a doação e querendo pegar meus filhos e eu à força. Sou livre, maior, independente, sei de cor uma Constituição brasileira. Não adianta você ser bacharel em direito, ser advogado, ser juiz e não saber as leis do país. Quem comanda o Brasil e o mundo é as leis, é a Constituição de cada país, de cada estado e de cada município. É uma Constituição só, é do Brasil, então todos têm que respeitar. O artigo 5º é inviolável a vida, a liberdade, o direito de ir e vir. Artigo 229, filho tem que ficar com pai e mãe. Sou livre, maior. Passei numa junta no dia 28 de outubro de 2015.
I remember we had malfunction on arriving progress vehicle, cargo vehicle that was coming to the station and was not able to talk with us in automatic mode. So Yuri and I were needed to do this approach and testing manually. And still things were not very smooth, so we had to actually use not a way to talk cargo vehicle. So we had a lot of very interesting and very difficult things. And what was interesting is, I remember from that mission, it was very interesting to see how, for example, during our
Passei na junta no dia 28 de outubro de 2015 e saí apta por esta médica. E não sou maluca de mostrar um retrato falado de uma médica e cheguei lá sem mentira. Sou igual Maria Bonita. Ó, boa no dedo também. Aqui num parque de exposição, não teve um homem que ganhou para mim no tiro aqui em Jequié. E tomando 10 cervejas em São João aqui. E eles para sabotar, uma vez que eu fui atirar, virou o cano para a bala voltar. É assim, sabotando 24 horas para provar o que não existe. E peço à Organização Mundial dos Direitos Humanos e à Polícia Federal que sou livre. Nasci em um país livre, e eles aqui em abuso de poder, em abuso de autoridade, pegando um Beto, porque é prefeito, que eu tirei 2 eleições lá com meu salário de polícia e com meu salário de diretora, porque ele tem um primo que é juiz, falsificando a doação, pegando netinha, querendo me botar sob a tutela. Me respeite, eu, a mulher mais cheirosa, mais cuido da minha vida, é o dia todo faxinando. Acabei agora de faxinar minha casa, 23 horas, ainda lavando uma pia de roupa, porque peço ao STF para tomar providência, que quando eu saio aqui, eles quebrando o cano e cagando as roupas todas, mijando as roupas todas, um fedor de podre, de chicote sujo nas minhas roupas, que eu tenho fissura por coisa cheirosa, eu não posso ver cheiro de nada. Duda é assim como eu, super cheiroso, uns podre, fedido, cueca suja, bacalhau sujo, apodrecendo as bananas dos homens, querendo interditar a mulher mais cheirosa do Brasil, e pegando o balde dos gatos, indo para a delegacia, fazer ocorrência de gato morto, e mentindo, e botando na casa da mulher, da mãe de Uri, que me deu carro para dirigir, uma blusa com gato. Love gato, me respeite, que nem de traficante de criança eu gosto. Botando as mães de doida para pegar, dopar os filhos, para dopar, dopando as mães para querer pegar os filhos, e agora querendo falsificar Love. E indo para a delegacia, ligando para a Bárbara para querer pegar força para fazer estrupo. Sou livre, uns 15 anos que eu, Obama online, que eu fico, e danço 15 anos através da Oi, da internet, para o presidente Obama, que eu amo muito. Falar em Obama é falar em tecnologia de país desenvolvido, de país desenvolvido. Que tem tecnologia para saber tudo. A NASA está aí mostrando as caras dos agressores, e ele, porque Júlio me fizeram de clara, e Júlio veio me salvar, eles querendo tirar a vida de Júlio, dizendo que ia fazer igual o Tico. Hoje eu fui comprar uma coca, colocaram lá o oficial de justiça, que é parente de Tico lá dentro, eles em abuso de poder, em abuso de autoridade. Aonde está escrito na Constituição brasileira, ir para mercado com oficial de justiça querendo fazer dope, na escalada da noite, com laudo falso de coração e suicídio, indo para casa no aeroporto, na casa de Glória, querer pegar meus filhos e dizer que é suicídio. E indo fazer dope também com minha neta. Esses dias eu cheguei lá, minha neta estava bamba assim. Eles fazendo dope de remédio com médico de laudo de coração. Pegando Bárbara, torturando, botando armas para me ir para vacinar. E a NASA viu que estava lá no colégio modelo da vacinação, indo para lá. Foi os bandidos da seringa lá, que pegou o irmão para me pegar 5 vezes, STF de seringa, fez a mesma coisa comigo, igual o Jalmir. A mesma coisa querendo fazer com Duda, com Bárbara, com minha neta na escalada da noite. Pegou um amante de Léo, botando dentro de casa 2 mulheres e dopando minha neta. Você já pensou uma mulher ver outra dentro da sua própria casa com amante, e ele batendo em Bárbara, o cabelo todo esfarolado de Bárbara, e dopando a criança 24 horas com laudo falso de coração e suicídio? E eles, a NASA viu a Genô, o Clóvis e o Nem, querendo me pegar, junto com a amante de Léo, me matar de seringa, para querer prender Júlio. Sou livre, maior, independente, o que é dado não é roubado. Passei uma procuração em branco para Júlio, delegado federal. Confio na Polícia Federal de olhos fechados, que eu amo muito. Foi os primeiros que ficaram tomando conta de mim depois dessa gangue querer me pegar de seringa. Mais de 3 anos online com a Polícia Federal, eles tomando conta de mim, para eles não invadirem aqui como invadiram. Quem invade de seringa, escoltado com gangue, escoltado caixa preta, depois fica dizendo, bota a família para dizer, passou mal, foi coração. Graças a Jesus Cristo, sou rica, super rica. Eu e meus filhos, meus netos, fez teste de pezinho, não tem nada, super sadio. Sou igual um robô, 24 horas trabalhando, E a NASA viu Júlio magrinho. Peço a Júlio que aqui a comida é toda limpinha, toda inspecionada. Se você comer essa comidinha, vai engordar. É uma comida toda medicinal, não é feita em óleo. O óleo que eu uso é só uma colher, com muito hortelã, muito cheiro verde, uma comida muito medicinal que eu faço para Duda e para Júlio, para quando querer chegar aqui. E eles querendo entrar dentro de casa, porque eu falo que a comida é para Júlio, para querer pegar, botar remédio na comida. E a NASA viu eles na casa de Nilson aí, querendo entrar para querer botar remédio no beiju, aqui na comida de Júlio. Sou livre, maior, e 15 anos dançando para o presidente Obama. E danço a hora que eu quiser, que eu sou livre, o corpo é meu. Não sou doador de órgãos, meus filhos não é doador de órgãos. E aqui eu danço a hora que quiser. A casa foi minha, foi fruto de um trabalho que eu lutei 20 anos trabalhando. Não foi irmão que foi trabalhar para conseguir casa, não. Que ela vai tomar casa de Maurício, o marido dela, do filho de Zé de Carioca, que matou polícia, que matou o PM, e de Beto, que ela é puta do café, de Beto, que fica fazendo ela e nem fica fazendo crime a mando desse Beto, ela é prefeito de Itaúna. Então, que vai tomar a casa dele. Porque desde pequena que ela trabalhou em barraca de feira com Dona Hilda, então vai tomar as casas de Beto. Minha casa, não. Minha casa aqui exclusivamente da Polícia Federal, para a Polícia Federal está aqui e ficar. E de Duda. Obrigado, Jesus, por tu existir, Polícia Federal. Se tu não existisse, eu não estava aqui para contar a história. Meu procurador é Júlio da Polícia Federal, com Duda e com Bárbara. Na minha cama, só deita Duda e Júlio, delegado da Polícia Federal, a hora que quiser. A chave com o Júlio para entrar, sair, tomar o banho de alfazema, beber, comer, fazer, que eu sou apaixonada por meus filhos, pela Polícia Federal. E tenho o maior respeito pelo STF, por Alexandre, porque a NASA me mostrou, Alexandre assim, fala assim, para a mulher se faz isso, e para a criança se bota no colo. Esse que é um grande ministro. Não é ministro cego, é um ministro já plantado, que foi secretário de Segurança de São Paulo, e Michel Temer foi um dos melhores presidentes que o Brasil teve, que falou em redes sociais na Globo que ia acabar com pedofilia, com tráfico humano. E a NASA viu o Saul Lomanto com a netinha querendo se casar para me matar e botar 4 num caixão, com meu caixão. O STF dizendo que ia me matar por causa que eu era fiel a Alexandre, porque eu era fiel a Semineto, a Júlia, delegado federal, e a Duda, que eu sou sempre fiel. Eles querendo pegar a quadrilha dos pedófilos que fez pedofilia com meus filhos, pegando a irmã para querer ir para posto, querer não está na época ainda de vacinação, e peço ao STF só para deixar eu e meus filhos vacinar com vacina dos Estados Unidos, que eles estão querendo pegar de vacina e dizer que é coração. Não tenho problema de coração, chamo o engenheiro Neto, porque eu não tenho problema de coração. E eu amo viver, faço guerra pela vida, e não há nada que a NASA não vê. Não tem coisa melhor. Se todo mundo fosse como eu, 10 anos, graças a Jesus Cristo, minhas mãos nunca mexeu com ninguém. É dentro da minha casa, faxinando, não discuto. Aqui é o dia todo, ó, em movimento, trabalhando, botando a casa cheirosa para casa. Quando eu for dormir, tá aquele ar gostoso, aquele ar puro. Há uns dias aí, eu fui na casa de um, não vou dizer o nome, porque eu gosto muito dela. A casa estava super cheirosa, que eu perguntei até qual era o lustramóveis que passava. Mas quando eu cheguei hoje na casa da filha dela, Jesus, me deu vontade de vomitar. Um fedor, e as crianças tudo brincando, os anjinhos de Jesus, que eu sou apaixonada. Tinha 4 anjinhos de Jesus brincando. Eu falei, Senhor Jesus, apartamento Para morar com criança tem que ser com gente limpa, porque se for com gente fedendo, o fedor fica todo dentro de casa e aquela criança fica respirando, não respira o oxigênio limpo, porque nós expiramos o nitrogênio e respiramos o oxigênio. E quem mora em apartamento tem que estar limpo. Eu fico procurando odor aqui para pegar e tirar tudo. E eu fico agoniada quando falta material de limpeza. Então, hoje mesmo fui almoçar umas 8 horas, aí eu vi o cheiro de comida, mesmo com micro-ondas, e o cheiro de comida, passei pano na casa toda para dormir com ar puro. E esta casa, a casa mais cheirosa, é interditada por paletó de bosta podre, cagado, Lucas, advogado do sindicato, mentindo, numa intenção dolosa de tráfico humano. Ele fala no processo dele, ele não tem criatividade, ele não tem fertilidade na mente. A mente dele, ele copia as coisas dos outros, ele não sabe nada fazer. Ele fica copiando frases bonitas de filósofo para tentar enganar os juízes que são caneta cega. Por que caneta cega? Com todo respeito a todos os magistrados, que eu amo muito, não tenho nada contra, que eu sei que às vezes é advogado que faz processos mentirosos para enganar, e é preciso que esses magistrados não assinem mais esses processos, que façam igual a doutora Carla, vai na porta ver, porque é mentirosos, são mentirosos. E eles ficam só assinando o que não vê, e aí pronto, a cabeça dele vai. Ainda mais quem estiver no probatório, a cabeça vai. Porque todo mundo é investigado, quem investiga o legislativo, executivo, é judiciário, é a Polícia Federal, que tem um poder de rei na Constituição brasileira, tem a Corregedoria do Judiciário, tem o STF para caçar tudo isso. E ele botando mente brilhante é a minha. Hoje mesmo eu fiz uma farofa, que no Brasil não tem. Eu inventei uma farofa. Eu inventei a farofa de calabresa, de cenoura. Sabe como foi que eu fiz a calabresa? Eu ferventei, depois botei limão, fritei no limão, e depois coloquei cenoura, maçã, inventei uma farofa, ficou uma delícia com tempero do Nordeste. Hoje mesmo eu faço um vestido com 5 minutos, só na tesoura, sem máquina. Aqui o vestido que eu fiz, ó. Eles me deixaram o STF, sem roupa. Tirou meu salário, tirou tudo de mim. Mas Jesus, aqui, ó, esse vestido que eu fiz aqui foi cortado, ó, de blusa velha, ó. Ó o modelito. Eu não usei máquina para fazer o vestido. 5 minutos eu fiz um vestido, sou a maior esteticista. 5 minutos eu fiz um vestido sem máquina de costura, só na tesoura e dando nó. Isso chama-se mente brilhante. Agora, você mentir, enganar o juiz, dizer que eu não tinha capacidade mental. Incapaz é você que fica copiando frases de filósofo que não são suas para tapear os outros. Eu não. Minha mente é fértil, minha mente é brilhante. Eu invento moda, eu invento comida, eu invento terapia, eu invento tudo. Minha mente é igual a Emília. Então, venha para debate, você com seu sendo bacharel em Direito, e eu com minha Constituição brasileira, que eu sei a atribuição de um STF, de um presidente, de um governador, e vocês aí querendo me pegar força para matar de seringa, porque sou fiel ao ministro Alexandre, à Polícia Federal, a ACM Neto, e a meu filho Duda, e a Júnior também. E meu procurador é Júlio, delegado da Polícia Federal. Sou livre e peço ao ministro do STF para botar eu, meus filhos, minha neta e Júlio, tudo sobre asilo político dos Estados Unidos com Obama. E Júlio, delegado federal. E a chave da minha casa, de meus filhos, de meus netos, com Júlio, delegado federal. Peço a Júlio para ir na escalada da noite ver Duda e ver Bárbara, que eles ficam fazendo dope querendo pegar força, falsificando a doação no nome de Léo para querer pegar meus filhos. Obrigado, Jesus, por tu existir, Júlia. Se tu não existisse, eu não estava aqui para contar a história. É contigo que eu, meus filhos e meus netos querem ficar. Não acredite em nada, que eu não traio, sou igual Maria Bonita. E estou parecendo Maria Bonita, quando se arrumava toda para passear, para ficar com o lampião. Cuidado, que Maria Bonita avisava. Curisco arrumou a mulher para lampião e se vendeu para os polícia que queria matar lampião. E aí falou, tu primeiro mata a Maria Bonita para depois tu matar lampião, porque ela vai atravessar na frente. A mesma coisa está querendo fazer comigo, querendo tirar minha vida para depois tirar a vida de meus filhos, da Polícia Federal, de todo mundo, que sabe que eu aviso tudo através da NASA. E obrigado, Jesus, pelos meus diamantes, são meus filhos, meus netos, e a NASA, diamantes com a NASA, que a NASA é a coisa mais linda que existe na face da Terra. Eu sou apaixonado pela NASA, não há nada que a NASA não vê. Que a NASA esteja comigo, com Duda, com Bárbara, com toda a Polícia Federal. O médico de meus filhos é doutor Deraldino, minha neta, e meu médico é doutor Bento, que eu tenho a maior coisa, mas graças a Jesus Cristo, não sinto nada, nada, nada. O que eu e meus filhos precisam é ser afastado do louco, insano e psicopata que está em abuso de poder, em abuso de autoridade, falsificando a doação em nome de Léo, de Netinha, e querendo vir pegar eu e meus filhos à força na calada da noite, querendo até fazer estrupo. Sou livre, e o homem que dorme aqui na cama só é Júlio, delegado federal, aqui na minha casa. E com meus filhos, Júlio também, Polícia Federal, dorme com Duda, Bárbara, minha neta, meus filhos e eu, pelo amor de Jesus Cristo, não deixa a gente só, não, senão eles matam. Obrigado, Jesus, por você existir, Polícia Federal. Aí, ó, o corpo é assim, você tem que botar o corpo em movimento, a mente para funcionar, para não estar fazendo besteira. Faça amor, faça guerra, compre camisinha, de preferência aquela de hortelã. Vá para dentro de casa, namorar. O sexo é bom quando você faz com amor, quando você faz com pureza, quando você não trai, para as bananas não ficar aí, tudo fedendo. Faça sexo com quem você gosta. Faça amor, não faça guerra. Deixa a vida dos outros. Deixa de estar matando. Não destrua o planeta Terra, não. O planeta Terra precisa de Duda, precisa de Bárbara, precisa de minha neta, precisa de todas as crianças do mundo. Então vamos viver uma vida. Faça amor, não faça guerra. Vai para suas casas namorar. Deixar a vida dos Hoje mesmo eu vi um ali sorrindo, fazendo a mesma coisa de mim, o bandido do baldo do gato. O bandido do baldo do gato mentindo, dizendo que a casa é suja, indo para a delegacia, dizendo que eu estou matando o gato, querendo me botar de doida na polícia, agora fica aqui. Sabe o que é que ele fez? Botou um gato lá na porta de onde eu dirijo, com a foto Gato Love, e botou na casa dele uma lâmpada vermelha, cada dia a lâmpada vermelha e azul, dizendo que eu botava assim a lâmpada vermelha e azul, Eu botava assim na época de ACM. Aí o Beto, com inveja, porque a ACM era apaixonado por mim, eu apaixonada por ACM, dizia que era o brega de ACM. Agora ele está falando, porque sabe que eu danço aqui, dizendo que é o brega de ACM. Agora ele está botando lá para pegar para dizer que o brega está lá. É cada coisa que só Jesus. Faça amor, não faça guerra. Todo mundo em suas casas, vai suas mulheres ficar bonitas, cheirosas, se lavar as casas, cuidar de suas crianças, botar as crianças no banho e deixar de estar fazendo mal, deixar de tirar a vida dos outros de seringa. Quem tira a vida dos outros, acha um para tirar a vida. Faça amor, não faça guerra. Coração de estudante. Quem não viu os estudantes, os jovens, ir para as eleições diretas livres contra a truculência, eles em abuso de poder, em abuso de autoridade, querendo tirar a liberdade dos jovens, forjando drogas, pegando crianças inocentes à força, de seringa, de remédio. Chega de violência. Duda tem uma vida, quer viver, minha neta tem uma vida, quer viver, os jovens têm uma vida e quer viver. E é preciso que todo mundo saiba votar. Porque quem comanda o Brasil são os governantes, e quem bota os governantes são o povo, então o povo fica de olho. Quem dá a ousadia, a gangue de seringa que mata criança, que mata gente, ninguém nunca mais votar. Antônio Carlos Magalhães foi o maior governador que o Brasil teve, porque na época de Antônio Carlos Magalhães, era a época que todo mundo dançava, praia, criança brincava, e falar de ACM não é falar de brega não, viu, Baldo do Gato? É falar em liberdade, é falar em vida, é falar nas pessoas viver. A época de ACM, as pessoas são bonitas, vive, bebe, namora, faz o que quer, as crianças brincam. E quem não sabe votar, vota em época de dope, que fica todo mundo dopado. Acorda, Brasil. O dia ficou para trabalhar e a noite para dormir. E eu sou da noite, eu gosto de dançar, brincar, beber, todo mundo. O médico que dopa a pessoa vem buscar os órgãos. Então, falar em ACM não é falar em brega, não, viu, seu Baldo do Gato? É falar em vida, é falar, as pessoas ficam mais bonitas, saem, namora, tem liberdade, as crianças vão para a escola, estuda, se forma, é advogado. Agora, falar em gente como o Baldo dos Gatos é falar em dope, em gente que só bota as pessoas dopando em cima da cama. Todo mundo namorar, trabalhar, deixar a vida dos outros, e cuidar de seus filhos, botar para formar, para estudar, porque o que acalma as pessoas é saber as leis, respeitar todas as autoridades. Eu só não respeito a autoridade que venha violar contra a minha vida, porque isso não é autoridade, é bandido. Aí 11 horas da noite não é horário de ligar som, mas eu vou ligar o som bem baixinho, só para me ouvir, que ninguém vai ouvir. E vou dar uma dançadinha aqui de 5 minutos e não vou pegar e vou botar som, porque eu sei que vai incomodar o vizinho aí dormindo. Mas eu vou dar uma dançadinha de 5 minutos só, com um sonzinho bem baixo, que ninguém vai ouvir, só eu. Obrigado, Jesus, por tu existir, Polícia Federal. Se tu não existisse, eu não estava aqui. Estou lavando uma máquina de roupa. Eu vou mostrar para vocês que eu não posso sair, que eles falsificam a doação em abuso de poder, em abuso de autoridade, querendo botar netinha e botar outras pessoas para entrar aqui para cagar as roupas todas. Já lavei duas pias, duas máquinas de lavar. Obrigado, Jesus, e é contigo que eu quero ficar, Polícia Federal. Faça amor, não faça guerra, vai namorar, deixa a vida dos outros, que é feio. Quem olha a vida das mulheres dos outros, aí toma esse, ó, toma 2 chifres.
in the presence of real structures. And this includes buildings, real-world environmental conditions like wind, smoke, etc. And this whole host of scenarios is fairly important to really collecting the data, which is at the heart of the national campaign.
So is the team starting to capture lessons learned that can be helpful to government and industry?
Yes, the team has been working quite hard. The national campaign team deserves a lot of credit for the fact that we were able to conduct a series of flight tests, initial flight tests, to really get us started in what we refer to as the anchor and evolve strategy. So right now we're in the anchor phase, and what that means is we're currently conducting what we refer to as National Campaign Dry Run. As part of Dry Run, we're flying an OH-58 Charlie helicopter as a representative AAM vehicle. That representative vehicle, we're able to test out these approach and departure procedures I referred to, our scenarios, as well as test out the national campaign's flight test infrastructure. So our instrumented system that we'll be able to deploy in order to support a number of future national campaign activities and flight demonstrations. So through these dry run activities, we've been able to collect some initial data. We conducted our first flights with a helicopter December 2nd through 4th, so it was quite a milestone for the team, and we were very proud to be able to accomplish that in today's environment. And some of the lessons that we're learning are the following. What are the communication protocols when we're working not only between NASA and the FAA, but also third parties that may be involved, like our industry partners? What are the data processes that are required? How do we share data with the FAA, and then not only share that data, but use that data in a meaningful fashion in collaboration with the FAA? Those are some key takeaways and lessons learned from our initial flight tests. We've also learned a lot about our scenarios themselves. So the routes that are capable of being flown and how those routes are developed, that's also been a big lesson learned from our recent flights. Also understanding what are the different indicators needed and platforms needed on board the vehicle to collect the right data that we're looking to support our scenarios. This includes instrumentation, the airspace integration and connectivity piece, as well as understanding how flight test engineer or pilot in control would be communicating with one another in order to execute our flight test cards. So those are all really important lessons learned from our initial flight tests.
Shivanjali, what aspects of your experiences so far could you share that might be helpful to NASA technical workers and project managers?
So one thing that I personally have seen, which I think is interesting and I think important, not only for the national campaign, but for other NASA projects as we continue industry, especially industry that might not be traditionally in the aviation field, so startups, etc., is that, from the NASA perspective, we have our traditional systems engineering and integration approach. So we follow a series of NPRs in order to go through a waterfall development process. That waterfall development process consists of sequential reviews, system requirements reviews, PDRs, CDRs, etc. And that waterfall process is important. But that waterfall process also implies that the requirements are mapped out and known before the execution of a particular test. But for the national campaign and the mission that we're trying to really move forward, those requirements may not be completely known, as this is an evolving and newly developing field. And so we might need a different life cycle process that we tailor and adapt to not only work more closely and more aligned with our partners, but also enable our team to operate in more of an agile fashion, where we build a little and test a little is really the motto that I think captures this agile type of development process. So the agile development system process is something that's used in software consistently across both industry and NASA. And I think if we can combine some of those aspects of agile with the traditional waterfall process, not only will we be able to execute safe flights, but also we'll be able to iterate more effectively and incorporate new requirements as we understand and develop them, and as we work more closely with our industry partners. And so I think that is one of the key lessons that I've taken away from my work on this project, is how do we combine traditional NASA waterfall processes with a more agile process to create a merge of the two. to really enable us to move the ecosystem forward, which is our goal under the national campaign.
Looking ahead, how do you see this activity affecting our everyday lives?
If the technology develops and continues the path of development that we perceive it to continue, this has a real impact on, I think, our everyday lives, whether it's receiving goods to our personal homes, the manner in which we may receive goods, the manner in which you and I may move from point A to point B could be directly impacted by the role of this technology as it develops. And that's really why NASA's taking a role here, is if we can enable these eVTOLs to fly safely and securely and integrate within our NAS, integrate within and develop the new infrastructure that's needed, integrate within our communities, both in terms of local governments as well as the community perception of this new form of transport, it really can impact our daily lives. And we can see some great benefits in terms of emergency use cases, as well as public services that can be enabled through this emerging market. So there's a great deal, I think, of hope and potential revolution in terms of how we move people and goods through the development of advanced air mobility.
So if you could articulate what's in your mind's eye, I would love to hear what your vision is of the future. Practically, how does that look once we get all of this into place?
There's been quite a bit of discussion about timescales and what the future looks like. Obviously, people have in mind a Jetsons type view of the future, and who wouldn't want to enable that type of vision? But I do think change will occur incrementally and over time, and I think in the next 5 to 10 years we will start to see some of these new form factors and new vehicles start to operate within our existing NAS. And then as the number of vehicles and the volume and density increases, along with the automation that's needed to support the vehicle performance as well as its operations within our NAS, I think what we'll see is increasing complexity and increasing density of these operations over time. Those timescales, even to me, I think are still yet to be determined at looking beyond 5 to 10 years. I think it really depends on the maturation of the technology, how the business use case evolves, and how we really enable this ecosystem. And so there are a number of factors that I think are going to play a role here. There are a number of barriers that we are exploring that I think are critical to enabling this type of transportation. Those barriers include some fundamental CNSI barriers. So how do you enable secure and robust communication in a digital framework? That is going to be a key unlock that's required to really enable this technology to flourish and be part of our lives on a daily basis. And so that's just one of the factors that I think that we'll need to explore, along with how do you certify and perform V&V of the increasing automation on board a vehicle as well as part of our ground systems. And so as we begin to conduct research, continue to conduct research, gather data, collaborate with research partners, the National Campaign really hopes to pull all those threads together to see if we can begin unlocking those barriers, to see if we can enable that vision.
Shivanjali, it's been so interesting hearing about this vision for the future and all of the work and the technologies. Thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was great speaking with you.
You'll find links to topics discussed on the show at apple.nasa.gov/podcast, along with Shivanjali's bio and a transcript of today's episode. If you haven't already, please take a moment and subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. For more interviews about what's happening at NASA, check out other NASA podcasts at nasa.gov/podcasts. As always, thanks for listening to Small Steps, Giant Leaps.
Houston, we have a podcast. Welcome to the official podcast of the NASA Johnson Space Center, episode 182, Mars Perseverance Landing. I'm Gary Jordan, and I'll be your host today. On this podcast, we bring in the experts, scientists, engineers, astronauts, all to let you know what's going on in the world of human spaceflight, space exploration, and today, landing a rover on Mars. On July 30th, 2020, NASA's Mars Perseverance rover launched atop a ULA Atlas V 541 rocket from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. Since then, it's been traveling at more than 50,000 miles per hour, cruising towards Mars to make the near 300 million mile trek through deep space for 7 months and land in Jezero Crater on the Red Planet. That journey is nearing its end. On February 18th, 2021, Perseverance will make its way through the Martian atmosphere and enter into what is famously known as the 7 minutes of terror. This is the phase of flight called entry, descent, and landing. For Perseverance and the teams at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, this may be the most critical 7 minutes of the flight to the Martian surface. So here to go into the details on entry, descent, and landing of Perseverance is Chloe Sakier, Entry, Descent, and Landing Communication Systems Engineer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So let's get right into it. Enjoy.
T-minus 5 seconds and counting. Mark. Launch that light, sir. There she goes. Houston, we have a podcast.
Chloe Sakier, thanks for coming on Houston. We have a podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, we're in the home stretch here. We're coming up on something I think you have been preparing for a very long time. How are you feeling in this moment right now, just being so close to the Perseverance landing?
Very, very excited. A little nervous. I think the nerves everyone is feeling as we get closer and closer. Right now, at the time of this recording, we are 30-some days away from February 18th, our big day.
That's right. And there's a lot to do just beforehand, and then what we're going to dive into today is exactly what this moment is that we're talking about, the landing and what's going to go down. I want to give our listeners, though, a bit of background and just kind of start from the beginning to talk about what this thing is that is landing on Mars and why it's such a big deal. Let's just start there, Chloe. What is the Perseverance lander?
Sure. So the Perseverance rover is the most capable rover that NASA and JPL have ever built and are sending to Mars. It's tasked with some really exciting mission objectives. It's searching for signs of ancient life, collecting rock and regolith samples for possible future sample results, and it's preparing for humans eventually traveling to Mars. The part that I'm most knowledgeable about is that it's landing at Jezero Crater on the Red Planet on the 18th of February of 2021. Jezero Crater is the site of an ancient river delta in a lake that used to fill this crater. And additionally, on top of all that exciting science, Perseverance also carries a smaller robotic buddy, a little helicopter named Ingenuity, which will be the very first aircraft to test controlled flight on another planet. So lots of exciting firsts.
Yeah, absolutely. Now this landing on Jezero Crater, this is you said it's a river delta, and it sounds very interesting. It sounds like that there's a reason that we're going to land in this area. What's so special about Jezero?
Yeah, so Jezero Crater was identified as a really exciting site that has a lot of scientific potential because it is this ancient river delta location. There are all these fascinating and super rich mineral deposits that scientists think might be able to help us answer those questions about seeking signs of ancient life. And also from an entry, descent, and landing perspective, it's a safe enough site for us to touch the Perseverance rover down at a nice, safe, clean location.
Yeah, right. You don't want a lot of stuff in the way of that landing, and that journey. It sounds like a long ways, right? I think it's like 300 million miles that the journey was from Earth to Mars, and it launched last year. July 30th, I believe, was the launch date. We kind of pushed it back, but we were still within that window. Were you there? Were you there at the launch? Were you able to witness it?
I was, yes. I was fortunate enough to travel to the launch at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. Of course, due to the pandemic, the launch wasn't quite the celebratory affair that we were all sort of expecting.
Right, yeah.
All of us were able to travel safely along so we could watch in a socially distant beach setting the launch and listen along and support our friends and colleagues on console as they ensured a successful and safe launch.
So there's a lot that goes into that, right? There was a lot of prep work to get Perseverance into that rocket. You've already mentioned a few of the objectives of Perseverance, so there's quite a number of instruments on there. But your role, Chloe, is entry, descent, and landing. So what have you been up to throughout the whole development of this, the Perseverance rover? What goes into preparing for entry, descent, and landing on Mars?
So entry, descent, and landing, I think, is such a fascinating phase of the mission because it's really just a handful of minutes, but it takes years and years and hundreds of thousands of man-hours of effort to ensure that those few minutes go safely and smoothly. My personal role on the entry, descent, and landing team is ensuring that our spacecraft is talking to us. I'm the entry, descent, and landing communications systems engineer. So I care about making sure that the rich set of data that we generate during entry, descent, and landing, or EDL, makes it off of our spacecraft, makes it to our orbiters at Mars, makes it through the deep space network, and then eventually back to us at JPL, so we can reconstruct exactly what is happening during those exciting minutes. We're really invested and interested in knowing exactly what goes on during those minutes, so we want to wrangle all of the ears that we can on the Earth side and all the ears we can around Mars and have them pointed towards Mars and listening into what the spacecraft is saying to us.
So what's it saying, Chloe? What do you care about when you're getting this data? What is meaningful data that's going to help you to be successful for the EDL phase?
Yeah, so we're really invested in what she's saying, in part because we want to know that she's okay, because those 7 minutes of terror, as it's often referred to, are really quite scary, and it's easily the most dangerous part of the mission. So we're invested in just hearing from Perseverance as often as we can during entry, descent, and landing. But we also want to understand what decisions she's making as she's progressing throughout that flight, throughout EDL. So we care about, she sends us little bits of explain what decisions she makes autonomously, and then of course once she touches down safely, the rover lets us know that it's all right and that EDL went well.
Cool. So what has Perseverance been up to so far? We talked about launch last year. Since launch, it was inserted into an orbit around the Earth, and then eventually did a trans-Mars injection burn to get all the way to that planet. What's happened since then? What has it been doing?
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, it's a nearly 300 million mile journey to Mars. And at this point, we've traveled nearly 250 million miles. But that 7-month journey is anything but quiet. Engineers at JPL like to keep a close eye on the spacecraft while she's cruising. We do all sorts of things to make sure that she is doing okay and that we're prepared for eventually entry, descent, and landing, and then the following surface operations. So we keep an eye on the health. We carry out general maintenance and monitoring, calibrate a lot of subsystems and instruments. We perform some small attitude corrections to make sure that we keep antennas pointed back towards Earth so we can talk to the spacecraft, and then we want to keep our solar panels pointed towards the sun so we get power. And then on top of all that, we also do these trajectory correction maneuvers to tweak the flight path and make sure we're headed to the right target. And then, of course, we do a lot of instrument checkouts for devices that we specifically care about during EDL. Turn on.
Now, I was looking at some of those course correction maneuvers, and there weren't many on the way to Mars, but from what I saw, they really picked up in the February timeframe, like right before landing. So why do you need to make at least these more major corrections or significant milestones? Why are they later in the flight?
Yeah, so we have 5 opportunities plus 1 backup and 1 contingency maneuver to adjust our flight path. And when those maneuvers occur, they all sort of have different. We get something different out of each one. So the trajectory correction maneuvers that we do earlier on, like a couple of weeks after launch, those help us point the spacecraft towards the general direction of Mars and fine-tune the flight path after launch, and sort of help us get rid of any injection errors that might have come from our launch. And then the TCMs, the trajectory correction maneuvers in the middle of cruise, like the December-ish timeframe, really helps us fine-tune that even more precisely. Then the maneuvers that we do in February, leading up to entry, descent, and landing, are really more targeted. And then also a backup and contingency maneuver that we don't plan to use, but are available to us if we need to at the last minute.
It's really about making sure that trajectory is right on target, because you got a tiny little area that you want to hit, right? And that's Jezero Crater, and you have 300 million miles to make the arrow fly exactly where you want to. I guess is a way to think about it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we like to joke around a lot that the spacecraft flies itself, the EDL flies itself, but we have to, our job leading up to EDL is to make sure that she has all the information about her the way that she's coming into the planet, because that really helps ensure that EDL comes off more successfully.
So this is not going to be just like a new thing for you guys. I'm sure that the Jet Propulsion Laboratory has put together simulations and programs and run through and tested what you guys believe is going to be the EDL environment, what's going to happen during those phases of flight. How do you construct those sims? How do they go? Just more about, I guess, practicing for the ultimate entry, descent, and landing phase of this flight.
Yeah, so we have spent a long time preparing, and as the saying goes, practice makes perfect. And we have many different ways that we essentially dry run or practice EDL to make sure that we understand everything about the system and we're prepared for anything that Mars might throw at us. So, like many other people on the EDL team, I'm also a member of the EDL testing in our test bed, which is essentially, I like to compare it to a car, because it's amazingly, the test bed is an amazingly complex vehicle in its own right. It's basically all the guts and brains of the real life spacecraft laid out on a table, and you can send commands to it and send it through these different simulated environments. So in this test bed, we basically get to dry run EDL over and over and over and ensure that the flight software is interfacing correctly with the hardware. I like to say that we're essentially rehearsing the choreography of EDL, and oftentimes in off-nominal situations, to make sure that the flight system is really robust. So sometimes we might do a simulation with an atmosphere that is different from what our model tells us to expect, or we'll do simulation with some important devices not supposed to be the way we expect.
So all of this was just making sure before you sent Perseverance into space for that ultimate landing that you had the confidence necessary to gone through all of these different simulated environments to make sure Perseverance she can stand up to the test. That's really the goal here. That's why you were doing all of these repetitions. You mentioned over and over and over all these repetitious sims.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing that people may not always appreciate about this phase is that there's no way really for us to test this system in an end-to-end manner on the ground, because we can't, or on the ground meaning on Earth here, we can't simulate Mars in the exact same way that we're going to be sending the spacecraft through. So we sort of have to test the whole system in bits and pieces, so we can test our flight software and we can go through these specific to bits of hardware in the system, like parachute tests or like tests specific to the rover, but we can't test it all together in an environment just like what we'll see in February on Mars until we're actually doing the real thing.
Now, this February landing, February 18th, from what I understand, this, I talked about in the beginning, ultimately the launch was July 30th, but there was this window, and I guess because of the way orbital mechanics works, February 18th is your day, right? There's no circle around and retry, like this is your moment, right?
Yep, there's no go around.
So it's got to work, right? That's why you do all of it. Another reason you do all of the tests is because you really only have one shot. There's no redo. There's no start over. It is one moment, one shot. Yes,
that's absolutely right. And like I mentioned earlier, this thing does land itself, but we need to help it. So we care about in our final approach phase prior to EDL, we want to get the spacecraft ready for EDL. So we monitor all of these activities that the spacecraft is doing, these reconfigurations and mode transitions and conditioning and turning everything on. We want to make sure we get to the right place to start EDL at the right time so that we're really on target. We make sure that our entry guidance that's run inside the spacecraft's computers, we're not stressing it too much and it's able to do the job that we're asking it. And then we also want to tell the spacecraft what it needs to know. So when I mentioned all the trajectory correction maneuvers and these parameter updates that we're doing in these last few weeks, that's what we're doing, and really preparing the spacecraft to hit that exact point, that exact location at that exact point in time.
So I want to get a picture of just what's flying through space right now, because we all saw the launch, but it was this rocket, and there was a shell on top of it, so we couldn't see kind of the construction of what this thing looks like flying through space. Give us a picture of what it looks like in the cruise phase right now.
Sure. So there's the and tiny little Ingenuity hanging on underneath. The rover is wrapped up in the heat shield and the descent stage and the back shell, and that all of those critical pieces right there are essentially the main players in EDL. So the heat shield will protect us during entry. The back shell is what we deploy our parachute from, and that's sort of behind the rover. And then the descent stage is what flies us to our actual, it's sort of like our rover jetpack. So all of that is packaged up and held by the cruise stage, which is the vehicle that takes us all the way to Mars. It has all of the fuel tanks and the radio equipment and antennas and everything. And that cruise stage takes us all the way to just 10 minutes before entry. And then at that point, we separate from the cruise stage.
You guys got a cool website where you can kind of see, it's like a map of where this is, this whole setup that you're talking about, where it is in space and how fast it's going. And last time I looked, it was traveling at 50,000 miles per hour. Is that how fast it's going to get 300 million miles away?
Yes, 50,000 miles per hour is quite a speeding ticket.
Yeah.
Well, it's got a long way to go, so we have some time to wait.
Well, Chloe, let's go into the entry, descent, and landing phase. This is the 7 minutes of terror, as you called it. I'm curious to hear why it is called that, but let's go through step by step. What's going to happen as it gets closer to Mars and gets into this phase.
Sure. So, as I mentioned just before, we separate from our cruise stage, that vehicle that safely escorted us all the way to Mars, about 10 minutes before entry. And then at entry, we hit the atmosphere of Mars. We use the atmosphere of Mars to start slowing down. It's thinner than the atmosphere of Earth, so we can't slow down completely using it, but there's enough atmosphere there that it does help us lead up off a little bit of velocity. During that time, we're protected by that heat shield. About 80 seconds after entry, we hit a period called peak heating. At that point, the temperature on the outside of the heat shield is around 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit or 1,300 degrees Celsius. Really, really hot. And during that time, while we're doing entry, we're steering towards our target using this principle called guided entry that was essentially adapted from the Apollo era. And this approach helps us stay on target while we might be hitting pockets of air that would maybe bump us around a little bit. While we're on that heat shield, we slow down to just under 1,000 miles per hour. And then at that point, we deploy the largest supersonic planetary parachute that has ever been used. It's about 70.5 feet or 21.5 meters in diameter. And we deploy it at about Mach 1.75. Also really, really fast. At that point, we're about 7 miles high in altitude and going around 940 miles per hour. And then shortly after that, we jettison our heat shield at about Mach 0.7. This uncovers the radar that we use to start searching for the ground. And this is where the terrain relative navigation concept takes the stage. And start searching for the ground. We use this concept, TRN, to take pictures of where we are and match those pictures up to an onboard map. So it's sort of like like if you're driving in your car and you're using a GPS instead of just looking out the window, you see pictures of where you are, and you match those up to your map to help you figure out and localize yourself. So then around this point, we drop out our descent stage. That rover jetpack drops out of the back shell because we don't want to recontact that back shell and parachute. We execute a divert maneuver to quickly get out of the way. At this point, we're just under 7,000 feet above the surface. And then while we're on that descent stage, that takes us down to a velocity of I think 0.75 meters per second, so way slower than we've been traveling before. And when we're traveling this fast, we're about 20 meters off the ground. And then at this point, we execute the sky crane maneuver. So this is what was originally debuted on the Curiosity rover, separates the rover from the descent stage from that rocket jetpack and touches Perseverance down safely and slowly on her wheels. And then as soon as we have confirmation of, as soon as the rover has confirmed that she's touched down, we separate the descent stage connection and fly the descent stage away to a safe distance. And that's all there is to it. We're on Mars.
All there is to it, but when you think about it, all of that, everything you just described happens in 7 minutes. And the challenge there is, I think, one of the challenges, at least, there's a lot of challenges, you just went over a lot of them, but one of them is, like you said, this is all happening by itself, because Mars is so far away that by the time it actually communicates what's happening to you on Earth, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, real time on Mars, it has already happened because of the communication, right?
Yes, that's true. Our one-way light time at this point in the mission is over 11 minutes, so it takes 11 minutes for information to travel from Mars back to us at Earth. And because of that massive distance and massive delay, we can't joystick the rover through landing. We can't fly it ourselves. It has to happen completely autonomously.
That's incredible. Chloe, I want to go through and kind of ask questions about every phase of this flight from beginning to end. We did actually have a subtle dropout. You were talking about you talked about slowing down and entering into the atmosphere. We kind of missed that part of it, but I think the question about that phase was, how do we get down from 50,000 miles an hour to the 10,000 miles an hour? Is that what you said was 10,000 miles an hour when you actually hit the atmosphere?
It's a little complicated orbital mechanics wise, but basically in cruise we are traveling 50,000 miles per hour relative to the sun. But then once we actually hit the atmosphere for entry, at that point we're going about 12,000 miles per hour, a little over 12,000 miles per hour.
Okay, so it's not really slowing. It's not really slowing down. It's just kind of relative to how fast Mars is traveling, or something like that.
Yeah, that's true. The 50,000 is relative to the position of the sun, and then when we hit the atmosphere, that 12,000 number, that's relative to Mars.
Got it.
But we do use the atmosphere to slow down significantly before we deploy our heat shield. We bleed off a lot of velocity up there.
Right. It goes from 10,000 to 1,000 miles an hour, right?
We deploy our parachute, just about around 1,000 miles per hour.
Now,
a little under.
I got it. You were talking about some of the sims you were running, and these parachutes. You're deploying them at supersonic speeds, right? I mean, I feel like if you were to deploy anything at that speed, it would just kind of snap. So how does that work? How does a supersonic? How are you able to deploy a supersonic parachute that's able to, perform that job and not snap?
Carefully. No, that's true. It's a blistering high speed, and to have a soft goods material that's capable of withstanding that, we basically build a really, really strong parachute and test it in all of these different stressing conditions. So when I mentioned earlier about testing EDL in bits and pieces, the parachute is obviously this critical component, the sort of quarterback of the team that a safe EDL is dependent and reliant on. So we test our parachute in big wind tunnels. We do sounding rocket tests to simulate what that supersonic deployment might look like and feel like to the parachute. and then all sorts of level tests as well.
So what's challenging? You talked about the heat shield heating up to, I think it was 1,300 degrees. You have supersonic parachutes that are deploying here. What are the challenges here with just Mars being the planet that it is? It's got an atmosphere, so you have to deal with that atmosphere. So you have to have a heat shield, but you don't have enough, a thick enough atmosphere where parachutes aren't going to do the whole, as much as they do on Earth for any missions that we have. We deploy parachutes and they land safely, either on land or water. What are some of the challenges here with just dealing with Mars?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's the common expression is there's not sphere to really use it enough to aerobrake to the point where we've have slowed down enough, but there's just enough atmosphere that you have to pay attention to it and take it into consideration. There's all of these, it's always fascinating to learn about Mars weather and to even think about what weather looks like on another planet, but Mars is a planet just like our own. It has weather, it has winds, it has dust storms, all of these components that we have to study and understand a little bit about so we can plan how they might impact us and affect us. There's the parachute. We already discussed the excitement of the parachute. When we get to the stage where we have jettisoned our heat shields and we're using our radar to search for the ground, that's a really fascinating point in the mission as well, because we're looking to land in Jezero Crater, which is a scientifically exciting location, but also from an entry, descent, and landing perspective, we need a landing site that is safe enough to touch down. So the things that we're looking for is an altitude of a landing site that's not too high, that gives us enough time to stop, and not too dangerous to land on. So not completely full of sand dunes or rocks or slopes or really rough terrain. We want it to be radar reflective to a certain extent, and the atmospheric conditions, like I mentioned, are okay, not too dusty, not too windy. So Jezero Crater is really this interesting spot because it's, from a terrain perspective, the most exciting that we've ever attempted a landing on for EDL. But we want to get there for the science, and our new technological functionality of TRN allows us to travel to that little bit more rocky, little bit more sandy crater that we care about visiting.
Well, let's go into that. Let's go into terrain relative navigation. This is a critical technology that was put on Perseverance. What is this technology?
Yes, so terrain relative navigation, simply put, it gives us eyes. So instead of just taking pictures on the way down, we're taking those pictures and matching them up to a map that is on board the spacecraft. Like I mentioned earlier, just like you or I could look out the window while we're driving our car and match up landmarks or things that we're seeing to a map. So TRN helps Perseverance figure out where it is, and once the spacecraft knows where it is, it can use its engines to fly to a safe landing spot that it picks and decides upon. So the humans behind the scenes have done the work over the last few years to map out and really understand every little nook and cranny of this landing site and identify using some fascinating algorithms and sometimes just our eyes the spots that we think are safe to land in and the spots that we don't want Perseverance to choose. And then we give all of that information to the spacecraft and in the form of that onboard map. And then while she's flying EDL, she takes those pictures, checks the pictures where she is against that onboard map and says, okay, this is where I want to fly, this is safe, I'm going to turn on my engines and lean over and fly that way.
So those engines, are they in the back shell and they're just kind of little pulses to guide it the right way?
We have a bunch of different engines in different places. So
okay.
There are the thrusters that we use to sort of but the descent state is what flies us to the safe that we pick.
Now, what's interesting, this is what I read, that terrain relative navigation jumps up the chance of a successful landing exactly where you want it from 80 or 85% to about 99%. So that's how good this technology is at guiding down based on all the sims that you've done and used it with.
Yeah, it's really incredible. As I mentioned earlier, what we're looking for in a safe landing site for EDL, slopes, craters, rocks, none of those things we really like. Those all really equate to landing death for EDL, but they're so interesting. They're massive science targets for the scientists, and at the end of the day, that's why we're doing this mission. We want to enable really, really exciting science. And so Curiosity and all the previous Mars missions had to ensure that anywhere that we could possibly touch down was typically a parking lot, no sand dunes, nothing like that. But we don't have to do that with Perseverance, mostly in part due to terrain-related navigation. There can be and will be rocks and craters in Jezero crater. The middle of the landing lip is a cliff right on the edge of the river delta. So I feel like if you were standing in the middle of Jezero crater and looking around, it would be quite beautiful, but it's exciting and a little more risky than had previously been attempted. But all of that is enabled because of the TRN technology.
So, Chloe, I believe like me and I'm sure thousands, if not millions of others are going to be glued to the TV trying to watch everything go down. What are we going to see? Are we going to be able to see some of the things that Perseverance is seeing, like the terrain relative navigation, providing a video feed? Are we going to be looking at the control room? What are we going to see?
So, yes, so me and my whole team will be at JPL monitoring. Awaiting with the rest of the world to your confirmation that Perseverance has touched down safely. And we'll be doing our best to share everything that she's telling us with the world in real time as that's happening. We have multiple different ways of relaying the rich data set that the spacecraft generates during EDL back to us on Earth during that time frame. We have tones via X-band that are sent directly to Earth. I like to say it's sort of like the spacecraft singing us a little song as she flies EDL. So these tones, each tone indicates a different critical event has happened. So we might get a tone for the deployment of the parachute, or a tone indicating that we just completed a bank reversal. And these tones just sort of provide markers of events that the spacecraft has checked off. We also get a tone, a pretty persistent tone, all the way throughout EDL that we call the heartbeat tone. And that's basically just the spacecraft giving us a thumbs up from Mars and saying, like, yep, I'm still alive, I'm still trucking. So we look to see that intermittently and make sure that everything is okay. We also receive the spacecraft communicates UHF data to our orbiters, to the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and the MAVEN spacecraft during EDL. Those are orbiters at Mars. And those orbiters relay that information to the Deep Space Network, which has stations in California and Spain and Australia, so all over the world. And those stations relay that data back to us at JPL. And the data set we get from the orbiters is a little bit richer than what the tones indicate. So it tells us more information about the decisions the spacecraft is making and the environment that it's experiencing throughout JPL.
And so you will be in that control room during the EDL phase, and you mentioned it before, but correct me if I'm summarizing this incorrectly. Is your job is to make sure all of these connections, this pathway of how Perseverance is communicating to you guys in that control room, that those pathways are all functioning normally and properly, and you're getting all the data you need.
Yes, that's exactly correct. I think the most fascinating thing about the communications and the telemetry side of the world is, just like it is in EDL, it takes so much effort, so much orchestration and conducting of so many people and so many teams for a small number of minutes to go off smoothly and successfully. So everything has to go right. Nothing can go wrong. For one bit of data to make it the spacecraft computer out of the spacecraft antenna, be received by the Mars orbiters, make it from the orbiters back to the dishes of the Deep Space Network, and then all the way back to our computer monitors at JPL. So there's not a lot of room for error. It's it's very exciting.
Well, I think you've kind of mentioned this throughout our conversation today, but you've referred to Perseverance as she, and I think correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like because of that pressure, because of all of your work going towards this one moment, you all in your own kind of special way have developed a connection to the rover, and in a way of kind of personifying it and making it into some instead of just a piece of hardware, something that you as a team can connect with and really engage with throughout this critical moment.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's definitely a significant amount of personification going on, but I've heard teammates refer to the spacecraft as like their baby or their child. Some people think of it as an old friend or maybe a dog. But everyone relates to it in a different way, but it goes without saying that it is incredibly meaningful to every scientist and engineer who's gotten the amazing opportunity to work on this project. So it's, it manifests itself in different ways.
So you came to JPL after Curiosity, that's correct?
That's correct, yes. I actually, I remember watching the Curiosity entry, descent, and landing in my bedroom in high school and thinking like, wow, those people are really cool. I wonder how I figure out how to do what they're doing.
I watched it too. I was watching it during an internship, and I watched it live. And remember, one of the highlights of the whole thing was, you were just watching the control room, and all these faces just glued to their monitors. And of course, the big moment that I think everybody that watched that live remembers was the celebration, jumping up and down, the high fives. That's something that you get to be a part of now.
It will, of course, look a little different than the jubilant celebrations of the past.
Right.
Celebrations in mission control looked like for Curiosity due to the pandemic. So, our first and foremost priority is to keep each other safe. So it's heartbreaking, but no hugs this time around. Just have to make do with elbow bumps, but that certainly doesn't diminish the incredible feeling of successfully landing something on Mars and the pure joy and disbelief I think we'll all feel accompanying that.
Well, you did. I'm sure you did get to learn a lot from the folks who have been a part of that moment before during Curiosity, right? The landing looks very, very familiar to Curiosity. So you have a lot of folks that worked hard on that and that you learned from, and I'm sure you got to learn from, what to do differently this time around to make sure we do consistently that was successful on Curiosity. I'm sure you got to hear a lot of those stories.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think that's easily the best part of the job is the people that we get to work with, and some of these people have been doing it not just since Curiosity, but decades ago. So they've been involved with so many successful missions. Their stories are unparalleled. Their important technical knowledge that gets passed along throughout the generations, but also just like ways of doing things that you can really only learn firsthand.
Yeah. So, Chloe, we're recording this, like you said, just about a month ahead of the actual scheduled landing. What's on your agenda from now until landing day on the 18th?
Right now, as we are recording, we are in the middle of our final operational readiness test, which we also call our EDL dress rehearsal. Up until this point, we've been, as we talked about, simulating and practicing on the spacecraft all sorts of different situations and scenarios. But now we're at the point in the mission where we have to train ourselves. We have to make sure that we are ready to deal with any sort of situation we might encounter. So we're stepping through all the motions with those final few days before EDL. So getting the spacecraft ready for EDL, getting to the right place to start at the right time, telling the spacecraft what it needs to know. So that's that process of trajectory correction maneuvers and parameter updates, and that cyclical sort of undertaking. And then, of course, in a few weeks, we won't be practicing anymore. We'll be doing that process for real.
There you go. Now you're going to have your celebratory, elbow bumps, as you mentioned, socially distant celebration. I'm curious, what's your role after? You've been working up to this moment, right? Entry, descent, landing. What's your role after EDL?
we go through a process where we try and make sure we understood exactly everything that happened and piece together the whole story. This helps us prepare and understand things better for future missions and really understand how our technology works. So we'll be piecing together all those little bits of telemetry and really trying to make sure we flesh out every single detail. And then, of course, the science will kick off on Perseverance, and the rover will start firing up all those instruments and carrying out the mission to search for signs of past life.
A really important thing. Now, Chloe, this is it's been a whole lot of work for you, and I know I can sense your excitement for getting ready for this moment. Kind of let us in on some of the culture, some of the not necessarily secrets, but just the behind the scenes of just working at JPL. Working with the teams that are working on this rover, and just the culture that you have there to put together a mission like this.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing culture. There's an expression at JPL that we dare mighty things, and I think to accompany that sort of mission philosophy, you have to have a tight-knit culture and a group of people that are really supportive, but also really push each other to do our best and put forth our best ideas. It's a little cliche to say, but I truly feel like the EDL team itself is so much more than just a team. It's a family in every sense of the word. There's a group of very interesting, very diverse, very wonderfully weird people, but I feel like we all complement.
So hard on something so complicated, and to have that kind of culture that brings you all together to make sure you're getting the job done, I think is a wonderful thing.
Exactly. If you have so many late nights in the test bed, it really helps to actually like the people that you're working with. It makes all the difference.
Well, Chloe, from here at the Johnson Space Center, we're going to be watching intently for the landing itself. We'll be rooting for you, and of course for Perseverance and all the great science that it's going to do after this critical 7 minutes of terror, the entry, descent, and landing phase. Looking forward to everything we're going to be learning when that rover actually starts doing its mission. Chloe Sakier, thank you so much for coming on Houston We Have a Podcast and describing in detail all the wonderful things that we get to look forward to. I know I feel prepped and ready and know what to expect for when I'm watching the real deal for live on the 18th. So best of luck to you and of course to your team.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun hanging out.
Hey, thanks for sticking around. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation with Chloe Sakier on what's going to happen during the entry, descent, and landing phase of Perseverance's journey to the Martian surface. Now, we are doing this podcast specifically on EDL for Perseverance. In fact, you can check out another one of our episodes, 174. That one's called Sticking the Landing on Mars. We talk with some experts about what happens when you add the human element to landing on Mars. But we are just one episode of many through all different NASA podcasts we have across the agency. Check out some of their episodes as well. We got Curious Universe, we got Gravity Assist, and they're going to be talking about different elements of Perseverance, some of the science and some of the sounds, some interesting parts of the mission. This is EDL, so make sure you check out some of those podcasts. You can go to nasa.gov/podcasts to check out any of those episodes. If you're curious about the Perseverance rover itself or want to learn more about Mars or its objectives, there's a good website for that, mars.nasa.gov. And of course, click on the Perseverance rover. Now, if you want to watch landing live, we talked about watching it live. We're putting this out ahead so that we can tell you exactly when it's going to land. It is landing 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 12:30 p.m. Pacific, and the broadcast is going to start 30 minutes before landing, 3 p.m. Eastern, and noon Pacific. So make sure you tune in right on time and watch the whole thing, especially those 7 minutes of terror. You can follow us, Houston We Have a Podcast, on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Go to the NASA Johnson Space Center pages of any one of those. And if you want to talk to us, use the hashtag AskNASA on your favorite platform to submit an idea for the show, and make sure to mention it's for us at Houston We Have a Podcast. Now, this episode was recorded on January 13th, 2021. Thanks to Alex Perryman, Pat Ryan, Norm Moran, Belinda Polito, Jennifer Hernandez, and Andrew Good. Thanks again to Chloe Stack here for taking the time to come to even in the middle of some of our preparations for this mission. Thank you so much for coming on. Give us a rating and some feedback on whatever platform you're listening to us on, and tell us what you think of the show. We'll be back next week.
I had just started on the team. This was about maybe 6 months to a year in. The science office, they said, you know what? We need to send the engineers to the Mojave Desert. There was one, I think this was towards the tail end of the trip. They took us to a site. They gave us a map. Said, okay, you are now the rover. And this is the only information that you have. These are just images, aerial images of the area nearby. Go tell us where you would find evidence of life. It kind of made me think like one day we could be walking on the surface of Mars and maybe doing the same exercise. So that was kind of cool.
This is NASA's Curious Universe. I'm Patty Boyd, and in this podcast, NASA is your tour guide.
My name is Christina Hernandez. I'm a payload systems engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California.
Christina is one of the engineers that helped build the Mars Perseverance rover, which will soon allow us to explore Mars in a way we've never been able to before. Ever wonder if there's life beyond our home planet? Some key answers might be locked up a little further into the solar system, on Mars. And over the past few years, NASA's been building a rover that might just hold the key.
When I started, we were still at a paper design, and we were just focused on trying to understand if it was the right design and how we were actually going to build this beast of a rover. And now, right, in the recent years, we've transitioned to what I love the most about engineering now is, building hardware, testing hardware, and eventually building the flight rover and flight instruments.
It's taken 10 years to get the Mars Perseverance rover ready for launch day. This summer, the rover will embark on a hunt for signs of ancient life on Mars. The historic mission will be the first step in a round-trip mission to Mars. It will collect rock samples for future return to Earth. The Apollo lunar samples, collected by astronauts decades ago, are still allowing us to make discoveries about the moon. There's no telling what samples from the red planet could teach us. And that's why these samples are at the core of the mission's 4 key goals.
So the first goal is, did life ever exist on Mars, right? Is there evidence of past life? And we have so many great science instruments that are going to help us answer those questions.
The second goal is to learn more about the climate on Mars.
What's Mars climate like, right?
We want to know how it became what it is today.
And at the same time, Mars climate could also help us understand our own Earth climate, which is, always important.
The third goal is to understand the geology of Mars, the sort of thing that Christina was learning about on that trip she took to the Mojave Desert. And then there's the last goal,
which is the goal that, as a little kid, this is the one I always dreamt of, is we are finally preparing for human exploration on Mars, right? It's an actual goal, right? It's always been a vision, it's always been a dream, but on this rover, it is one of our 4 science goals. And so that's why we're going to Mars, and that's why folks like me are so excited for this mission, because this is cutting edge stuff.
But Perseverance still has a ways to go before it starts on these goals. In late July, the mission's launch window opens. After leaving from the Kennedy Space Center, it will take the rover 7 months to travel to Mars. That means it'll get there in February 2021, at which point it will have to complete one of the most difficult parts of the entire mission.
We're talking about entry, descent, and landing, or EDL, the EDL process.
It's known as the 7 minutes of terror. For that period of time, NASA will not be able to communicate with the rover, and the computer will have to move the mission through a perfectly choreographed set of motions without any help from the ground. Mitch Schulte, the Mars Exploration Program Scientist at NASA headquarters, will walk us through what the EDL process will look like for Perseverance.
The entry part is when the rover first hits the top of the atmosphere of Mars. The heat shield then starts to interact with the atmosphere, creating a lot of friction. This creates a lot of heat, but it also takes some of the energy out of the spacecraft as it's coming into Mars. The heat shield eventually drops off after we've gotten through enough of the atmosphere and slowed it down enough. At that point, we have a parachute that deploys out of the back that opens up at hypersonic speed, so it's going faster than the speed of sound. We have a very large parachute then that helps us slow it down even further. And then by the time that the parachute slows us down enough, the rover will drop out of the back shell that's carrying the parachute, so we'll be free of the parachute. At that point, what will happen is that there's a radar on board the rover that will detect where the ground is and fire the retro rockets that will finally allow us to get the rest of the way down to the surface of Mars. So we're going to a place on Mars called Jezero Crater, Jezero. This is actually a crater that was once filled with a lake, and it's in a really ancient part of Mars, about 3.5 billion years old. This area of Jezero Crater, which is now dry, there's no liquid water in it now, but there's evidence in the rock record that there was a liquid water lake there 3.5 billion years ago. And everywhere we go here on Earth where we have liquid water, we find life. We in the Mars Exploration Program like to point out that we've been sending things to Mars for quite some time, and we'll be happy when the humans finally get there, but we've got an entire planet inhabited by robots at the moment. What we're really trying to establish on Mars is whether there was life there in its ancient past. So now that we've established was liquid water early in Mars's history, we think that it could have been habitable, like Earth was and is now. So we really want to get after this idea of establishing what kinds of places on Mars were habitable and whether life actually did get a start on Mars. And so what we're doing in sending all of this technology and these technology demonstrations and this hardware to Mars is really helping us move forward in
Now you might be wondering, what will Perseverance look like if it's roving around Mars? And what will it be doing? Well, it looks very similar to Curiosity.
because it's the same design. And the reason that we use the same design is, one, we know it works really well on Curiosity.
Imagine a car-sized robot with extra limbs and a camera for a head.
We have upgraded the wheels. It turns out the rover actually is pretty heavy.
Perseverance clocks in at 2,260 pounds.
So that's been putting some strain on the wheels. We've corrected, so the wheels are going to be much better this time around.
One of the great things that we do have is data to try and understand the different types of terrain and also the slopes that the rover could see. The Perseverance is equipped to kind of handle different types of terrain because of the wheels, and we even have requirements to say, look, we need to be able to travel up slopes that are 20 degrees high, right? Because we need to be able to just be prepared for if there is something interesting that's really going to drive us over there, we have to be ready.
Christina likes to think of the different pieces of Perseverance as they relate to the human body.
So for example, within the rover, right, within that kind of that big box, all the vital organs, all like the sensitive electronics that kind of give life to the rover, that's where that's kept. When you think about, the rover, right, the rover is kind of like a robotic scientist, right? We try and pack as much as we can of what a geologist would do, what tools they would bring, and put that on the rover. We've got the brains, which is obviously the electronics and the software that control everything. We also have the neck and the head, which on the rover, we call that the mast, the remote sensing mast. And the remote sensing mast on Perseverance has all these really neat cameras that are like a first and really cool. And, obviously the wheels, right? We got to rove around and go check things out.
And as Perseverance is doing all of this, it's got to keep us in the loop.
And the way we talk to Earth is through our antennas. So that's what we use to speak to Earth and also allow Earth to say hi back and check in on us. So that's kind of like the overview of the rover.
It's always exciting to get messages from the rovers through those antennas, receiving pictures and data as it explores the red planet. But this time, we're hoping to get something else. We've successfully landed 8 spots on Mars before, 2 of which are still working, and each of them have helped us understand the planet a bit better. But Perseverance is taking us a step further.
Unlike other missions that have brought samples back from celestial objects before, like comets and asteroids, this time we're bringing samples back from a planetary body, Mars, that may have had life on it.
We're trying to bring pieces of another planetary body all the way back to Earth. And we're hoping that those pieces, the sample, help us answer a question. Did life ever exist on Mars?
We want to make sure that we do the best job in collecting these samples, and we're going to be doing it from 150 million miles away.
Kind of like when Christina and the other engineers went to the Mojave Desert and were told to look for rocks that might show signs of. But instead of a short drive across California, we're talking about a 7-month journey through space. And instead of our own 2 hands, we've got a car-sized, semi-autonomous robot doing the job.
So they've built in a lot of technology that will enable careful handling of the samples and make sure that we get the best possible samples that we can get.
And when you bring a sample back to Earth, you can give that sample to institutions across the world, have them use their labs, have them study it for decades to come, right? And it's huge, right? We've never done this before.
While sample collection is one of the most exciting parts of the rover's mission, Perseverance will be quite the multitasker. One of the instruments will test out how we might convert carbon dioxide to oxygen. This could fuel future rockets to get them back to Earth, in the event that, we get humans there and they want to come home. Another instrument will monitor the weather on Mars, keeping track of temperature, humidity, and dust size. Each of Hi, Carrie.
Peço a Júlio e a Obama, o delegado federal, para ir no aeroporto onde está a Duda, que o bandido do oficial, parente de Tico, que estava no mercado querendo pegar Coca-Cola e colocar remédio de Júlio, está lá no aeroporto falsificando a doação no nome de Léo para querer pegar meus filhos a mando do prefeito Beto, que tem um tio dele que é médico de coração, e querendo fazer troca de meus filhos. Meus filhos é Duda e faço guerra pelos meus filhos. O artigo 229, filho tem que ficar com pai e mãe. Peço o ministro Alexandre com a Polícia Federal para extraditar o louco insane que está nas madrugadas na porta, gritando e atacando, botando armas em cima de Júnior para querer trocar meu filho e pegar meu filho de remédio de seringa. É tráfico humano. Não há nada que a NASA não vê. A NASA viu o retrato falado do oficial atacando Duda e Júnior lá na porta de Glória.
Miss Universe listeners, before we get into the episode, we have a quick note for you. On February 18th, 2021, NASA's Perseverance rover landed safely on Mars and recorded sounds from the Red Planet for the very first time. The interviews you're going to hear in this Sounds of Mars episode were recorded before the landing happened. You're going to hear about what NASA experts
Quem viola a Constituição brasileira, quem viola direitos humanos, falsificando a doação, indo nas madrugadas na porta com oficial de justiça, que é com Léo e oficial querendo pegar Duda, é extraditado, vai tomar uma injeção desse tamanho lá com os Estados Unidos para não querer pegar crianças à força.
I'm Patty Boyd, and in this podcast, NASA is your tour guide.